I stumbled across a book in the library on Saturday afternoon. I hadn't been getting many weekends off here lately because of the holiday season. And I stumbled across this thing that actually brought back some memories I'd actually put out of my mind because I remember 2013, 14 when this book came out. It was kind of a popular, buzz thing among the so-called pseudo-spiritual, pseudo-scientific people that I used to encounter in AA. I'm not talking about uh, necessarily these meetings that call themselves agnostic. I'm talking about the people I used to run into in AA that they love to drop certain names of certain, new age quackademic type books or authors or something like that whenever they were sharing in order to sound a little bit more intelligent than they always were. Or they would use some scientific buzzword that they didn't comprehend the definition of as an excuse to try to say, this proves the big book or something like that. But I remember this book. It was called The Accidental Universe by Alan Lightman. And these people were going on and on about, and there was a few of them. There was a couple of these gurus that I remember in particular is who comes to mind because I remember this title and them spouting that. But they mainly like to, catch people outside or in meetings after the meetings and stuff like that. And they would say something like, my sponsor taught me everything that this guy is saying. And this was years before this book ever came out. You can't explain how that happened. And you can't explain this. And so therefore God in AA is true, And I call it AA God for a reason because that's the cult religion's idea of God is a God that will bestow blessings on you as long as you're not drinking and doing inventories and talking about what a piece of shit you are while simultaneously mistreating people. Used to kill me one of the worst people I used to know, and I do mean worst. I mean one of the top worst, and I met some real scum in AA, right? I mean I met some really lousy people in AA, but one of the worst ones I ever met would say something like, "The big book says we have to be hard on ourselves and considerate of others." And I wanted to say, well, when do you do that exactly? Like, I've never seen you be hard on yourself. All I've ever seen you do is brag on yourself, and all I've ever seen you do is mistreat everybody who's a relapser or everybody who's in a vulnerable position. I mean, etc. It was like when I was talking about the that Sermon on the Mount bullshit a couple of videos back. I remember one guy, and I now know where it came from. It came from Sermon on the Mount, but he used to sit in meetings and he would talk about, you see, I'm not punished because of my sins. I'm punished by my sins. And I wanted to say, so let me ask you this question. When you're buying food stamps off of people who are heroin addicts right down the street that are living in those alleys and those gutters, I mean, is that a sin that you're going to be punished for? Or do you think the great God of AA that blesses you for not drinking and doing step work is he kind of cool with that? Does he look the other way when you do that, or when you're actually hitting on these vulnerable people that come out of like that one all these sponsees you got mowing your lawn and doing all your housework for nothing? Is that not a sin that your AA God's going to punish you for? But it was those types of gurus that was touting this book. I remember, and you know how I'm sure you've encountered these types in the meetings. They have to speak so grandiose, like there's some big gigantic royalty, and they have to frown really seriously, like they're saying something so deep, and they're generally just ripping shit off that they probably heard in some fucking movie, and taking some big book stuff, and then taking some stuff they read in some outside cover of some book somewhere, and just jamming it all together to say absolutely nothing, except I'm so important. It's kind of like that one old timer I told you about that used to say the great mystery of AA is it's not all about me today, but it's ultimately all about me, and it's a mystery you can never explain. Well, no, it's really easy. There's no contradiction there. It's all about you glorifying your fucking self like most of these people do. But anyway, this book, The Accidental Universe, I remember the couple of dudes that used to spout that. These are the two dudes that had to get called on near the end of every meeting. I'm sure anybody who's attended AA knows exactly what I'm talking about. If the right people were chairing, the cool people that got to chair the meeting, they would always make sure at least the last 20 minutes or so of the meeting was where these two or three guys could get called on, where they could rebut everything everybody else had said, and where they could take shots at those of us that were relapsers, and they could do all of that. Well, there was a couple of those dudes like that was always spouting this book. And And like I said, I had forgotten all about it, but I saw it at the library, and I decided I'll sit down and read it and see what it's all about. Because the big thing they were saying is science and spirituality are one, and can never, in other words, science understands that spirituality is this great thing, and the two will never be able to cancel each other out or some shit like that. I don't even know if science and spirituality is actually at war. I mean, science can only measure what it can observe and see. That's about the end of science. I mean, whatever they're talking about with AA and not drinking being the hand of some righteous AA deity that gives you parking spots and allows you to abuse newcomers, I don't think that, belongs in the realm of science. But it's a fairly thin book by this theoretical physicist. He calls himself Alan Lightman, and I read it. I didn't read all of it. I got about halfway through with it, and I said there's so much contradictory shit in here that I think I'm just going to make a video about it, because I don't know what great things that they claim they were finding in this, because, well, other than the fact it likes to contradict itself, which is something AA people are great at doing, but Alan Lightman, early on in the book, makes this assertion that an interventionist type deity could not possibly exist because it would have to violate the laws of physics. That there's no way that something could exist outside of space-time and actually do things in people's lives, like getting them parking spots or like getting them sober or something like that. He's actually claiming that such a thing is not possible. But then he turns around in another chapter in an attempt, I think, to pander at the people like these idiots in AA that were touting this, and he says that science will never be able to explain what spiritual people feel, and science will never be able to explain why spiritual people have happier lives than those who do not. Well, if science can't explain what spiritual is, how do you know that these so-called spiritual weirdos are having happier lives than those of us who do not? I know this is helping the book sales go up on shit like this, but I mean, you haven't given me a satisfactory definition of how you know that these so-called spiritual people that science doesn't even know how to explain are living more fulfilling lives than the people who don't, when you just got through saying in another chapter that there's no way a deity could exist if it violates the laws of physics. But then you turn around and say physics can't ever explain everything, and something could very well be out there controlling the whole entire universe, and we'll never be able to understand it, after you just got through saying in another chapter that there's nothing in the observable eye that we haven't discovered and that we already know all about, and that, the idea of anything religious is actually just a delusion. You say that in one chapter, then you turn around and say science doesn't even know what religion is or what spirituality is and how wonderful it is, which is very contradictory. I know that there's going to be people out here that's going to jump on me for this and say, well, how dare you question a physicist? I mean, he's way more educated than you'll ever be and knows way more than you'll ever be. Who are you to question this? I'd love these little arguments from authority that people throw at you like that on something like that. I mean, if something is an obvious logical contradiction, it doesn't matter if the person's a physicist or who they are that's saying it. It's still a logical contradiction. It's kind of like a long time ago, I once said that I wasn't too wild about the books of Stephen King, and it was on a message board pre-Facebook era. And there was all these Stephen King fans everywhere. Well, how many millions of dollars have you made off of writing books? How many successful movies have you made from your books? How dare you talk bad about it? Well, by that same token, at the time, I remember saying Justin Bieber makes millions of dollars off music. How dare you not buy all of his CDs because he's made millions off the music? I mean, just because someone has made millions of dollars or accomplished something in the world of the music industry doesn't make them above criticism. I mean, how many politicians on both sides of the aisle are millionaires and billionaires, and we all are in agreement that they're crooks? So, the idea that somebody's famous or somebody's educated or somebody is a celebrity and therefore you cannot question their talent or you cannot question what they're saying is a stupid idea. It's rooted in an argument from authority fallacy or an appeal to popularity fallacy. An appeal to popularity being, this guy's got 1 million people that love his songs, so therefore you can't criticize him. Same thing with somebody who claims to be a theoretical physicist that I believe was obviously pandering, in my opinion, to both crowds in order to drive up book sales. There's one chapter where he says he has absolutely no patience whatsoever for these hideous men like Richard Dawkins who are out to destroy all spirituality and out to do this and out to do that. And I'm not going to say I agree with Richard Dawkins. Okay, I'm not an atheist. I've said that before on here. But you're creating, what he's doing here is he's creating a parody of Richard Dawkins. Okay, I have read Richard Dawkins. I know what he said. I have watched Christopher Hitchens debate, and I don't agree necessarily with Christopher Hitchens, but I can't deny that Christopher Hitchens was an amazing debater. He could crush the other side like nobody else I've ever seen. And I mean, he would have destroyed AA people in a heartbeat. But to paint this picture, this straw man of what Richard Dawkins is, and say you have no patience with him, is very contradictory when you turn around in the same sentence and say anybody who believes in God has to be delusional. But then you turn around and out of the other side of your ass, you say that people who are spiritual are onto something that cannot nobody explain and will never be resolved by science. After you just came to the conclusion science explains everything. No wonder the AA people like this book. It's full of the same contradictory bullshit they like to preach in meetings all the time. And I remember... I used to get attacked a lot in AA back in the days when I used to bother to try to speak or share or anything. Towards the end, I mean, I didn't even bother. For one thing, everybody knew I was going to die drunk, and everybody knew that I was just, one of these people that was incapable of being honest, and that therefore, that I was nobody. But people used to say, well, you can't use logic to figure this thing out. Well, I mean, logic is a really good... it's a really good sounding board, I think, or a good basis for how we judge and look at reality and how we make our decisions. Even in their fucking big book, Bill wants to say logic is great stuff. We loved it. But when we were approached with the idea of a spiritual realm, well, logic says if some dude walks up to you on the street and says there's an invisible realm, logic says that, well, this guy's kind of crazy or he's trying to sell me something, right? And believe it or not, there is a chapter in this particular book where he talks about this very scientist that just said religion is for the delusional, but religious people have more fulfilling lives. It just said spirituality is a mere dream and creation of the human mind, but claims spiritual people, have something that the rest of us don't. He has this one chapter where he talks about these two birds, okay? Yeah, these two birds that were in his backyard or near his island home or something like that. And he watched them all season long building their nest. And he watched them taking care of their eggs and whatever. And, the eggs hatched and all this other, he goes into this long dramatic spiel about it. But he says the birds took off and flew. And as the birds were taking off and flying, they glanced at him. That's right, they glanced at him. He made eye contact with him, and somehow or the other he knew in that moment that the birds and he had telepathically communicated, and that the birds understood who he was and that it was his property, and he understood that the birds understood that they were sharing the same land together, and therefore they were like brothers in kinship and all this other stuff. And he said at that moment, it was almost like this Bill W. shit in the big book. At that moment, he absolutely knew that a spiritual realm existed. Some birds glanced at you, right? I mean, you're this guy that said science has explained everything, and spirituality is delusional, and a God can't exist because of the laws of physics. But then you say, some birds glanced at you, and there's a spiritual realm that science will never be able to find. Are you sure you're actually, you needed a proofreader or something for this, or you needed to go back over your notes before you publish this stuff and realize, this is not going to appeal to either side here. I mean, your so-called hardcore atheist people are not going to like it because you're more or less slamming people like Dawkins and saying they're savage-type people who are trying to destroy faith. But then you're calling people of faith delusional. But then you're saying that you understand that there's a spiritual invisible realm because these birds glanced at you. Okay, no wonder the AA people love this thing so much. But yeah, I mean, I'm reading through this thing, and I was like, well, theoretical physicist or not, what this guy is just another quackademic. Is what he is. It's kind of trying to appeal to everybody in order to drive up book sales. It's kind of like something I read a long time ago. And it was another one that did this very same thing that it's guilty of. It was called Why God Won't Go Away. And it makes this assertion that the only way God could exist would be in the human mind, which it doesn't really provide any substantial proof for this. It just says that, we did CAT scans on spiritual people during their meditations, and we know this to be true. But then it does go on and make the same assertion. It says religious people have better lives than those who don't, or these spiritual people have better lives than those who don't, or it was like one study that later came out to be conclusively false. It was doctored, where these so-called patients who prayed got better miraculously on their own, and the people who didn't pray, of course, went on and died, or some shit like that. I remember like one of these documentaries, What the Bleep Do We Know, that put forth so-called evidence like that, and it was later turned out that it was all doctored and made up. But again, it's another attempt to pander the best of both worlds. It's kind of like I used to see AA people that would try to dodge the bullet by saying, I don't even know what God is. But that's kind of a lie, because you say God got you sober. You say God gets you parking spots. You say God kills other people who are relapsing all the time so that you can live longer. So, it's a duck cover, logically inconsistent bit of trash. But I read that and I said, I'd forgotten all about those gurus that had to be called on at the end of the meeting, and they had to rebut everybody, and they had to spout this gibberish nonsense, which was ultimately just what he's trying to do. It was an appeal to popularity. I can make you feel spiritual while telling you you're delusional, and you'll be so stupid you'll buy the book and you'll feel like you're onto some vast modicum of knowledge about the way the universe works. Anyway, I think that it's going to be a briefer video, but I think I've done summed it up what I was going to talk about there. I do have a viewer suggestion that I want to that involves something that I was actually planning on doing before this topic just leaped into my head by accident because of stumbling across this book. But if you've ever bumped into these AA academic types that I've talked about, or these AA wannabe, the gurus that get called on at the end of the meeting and get to make grandiose speeches, and then they'll even claim it's not all about them today. Let me know in the comments below. And until then, I'll see you next time.